this side will be better. You see this camera? You're in the far left for you.
So
I
here?
think, yeah, this side will be better. I play by your ear.
All right, let's give it one curiosity clip. Welcome to Matt Reed of Beekeeping.
Hello, everyone. You can hear me? Am I good? So I'm here tonight to talk to you about beekeeping, getting started in beekeeping using natural methods. But before I do that, I want to go back in time to 2008 when my wife found a honeybee in our kitchen. And I've told the story a million times. I've told it on national television. I've told it to thousands and thousands of people. But I'm going to go back through the history of bee thinking in about 10 minutes here to show you what that bee did to my life. Many good things, many terrible things, but that's why I'm here today. And I'm hoping that each and every one of you can be impacted in a similar way by honeybees and other pollinators, because truly without them, we wouldn't be alive. So in 2008, again, my wife found a honeybee in the kitchen. And I'm the guy who saves all the unlovable creatures of the world, the spiders and other bugs that we find. And she told me to save this bug. And I didn't know much about honeybees. I knew they made honey, and I liked honey. I knew that they stung and they died when they sting. And that's about it. So I grabbed a plate, I put honey on the plate, I warmed it up, and I pushed the bee onto it. And she sort of waddled over toward the honey and started drinking and gaining energy. And I was very impressed by this, that I'd done this. You know, this bee looks like she's going to come back to life. And then I took her to the front porch, and I really wanted to learn more about these creatures. And about a month later, I had my first beehive, which is in the left picture there. I'm staring into this hive. It's the middle of the night. Bees generally don't come out at night, and there were bees for thousands. I wasn't a woodworker cutting my arms off. I made nicer hives, and I started blogging about it, and people started emailing and saying, hey, can I buy these things? And then I decided I needed to take a woodworking class because I am truly atrocious at making wooden things. And I took a woodwork, and it was better than what we had. And that was our grand opening. You can see the throngs of people coming to see what we were doing. So volume began to increase. We're selling more hives by 2011. I had a few more employees, and I would go to our supplier and pack up the hives. That worked a lot better. And then we rented a space on Hawthorne in southeast Portland, which is still, we technically have that space right now. And I traveled around the country a great deal speaking about beekeeping, helping people get started to keep bees more simply. And this is, I believe, in Pennsylvania. I met Temple Grandin, if any of you have seen her before. She's pretty cool. And then in our Hawthorne space, that was the entryway. And so it was sort of a retail space, sort of a warehouse. No one knew what to do when they came in. They wondered if we were really open because they couldn't get past all the packages that we were shipping out. Swarms, probably my favorite part about beekeeping. It's a magical experience to come across 10, 20, 30,000 bees hanging off of a tree branch. Or in this case, this is a USPS van. And it had landed on the van, and the male person decided to get on the freeway and try and get the bees to go away. And that didn't work. The bees then just moved into the taillight, wondering what was happening to them. You know, their resting spot was on the move. And so I had to take off their taillight and try and get these bees out. And it was a whole ordeal. I applied for Shark Tank, the TV show, in 2013, and that was when they called me in 2014. And then we said, hey, let's have a baby too. So we had a kid. And that was right before I walked into Shark Tank to pitch, if any of you have seen that show. The funny thing with Portlanders is most of them don't know what that is, it seems. They assume I was on Shark Week, which is a very different thing. And they can't understand what bees have to do with sharks. And so you travel across the country and other cities, they're much bigger fans. Immediately upon birth, I took him into the bee yard. He was a lot tougher than me. He's not even wearing a bee suit. And then we finally got a real warehouse where we could actually use a forklift and move product around. This was our entire team back in early 2015. I think we had maybe 7 employees by mid-2015. And then we aired on Shark Tank. And so a lot of people watched that TV show. We had over 14,000 people on our website at once during the East Coast airing, and it was quite an experience. And then they decided to film another TV show, Beyond the Tank, where Damon John, this guy, he really liked what we were talking about when I filmed Shark Tank, and he actually bought a bunch of beehives and put them on his property in upstate New York. And he told me I was probably the most influential entrepreneur that he'd encountered on the show, that he showed him that honeybees are important, and without them he wouldn't have food, and he had no idea. And so he really got into it, and we still chat here and there about bees and beekeeping. And have any of you seen this thing, Flow Hive, before? So that thing also changed my life in terrible ways, which I'll talk about. So we took on the Flow Hive project when they called us in the spring of 2015. And Flow Hive was the largest Indiegogo campaign in history. They did over $12 million on their campaign, and they were in New York Times and BBC, and every major media was talking about this thing. Their goal was really $100,000, and they did $12 million. And it's these two guys, Cedar and Stu. They're amazing Australian guys, but they had no idea what they were getting into. And I just wanted to show this part, the side effects of crowdfunding, especially incredibly successful crowdfunding, and what it can do to businesses that get involved with it. The Coolest Cooler was another product that released, and I think it was based here in the Pacific Northwest, and it also failed horribly. And so Flow Hive, we had just aired on Shark Tank, and then Flow Hive called, and we ended up having to grow from about 7, 8 employees to almost 50 employees to try and fulfill this project. And it was probably the largest shipment of beehives in the history of the planet, and custom beehives in a matter of 6 months. And we learned a lot, and we brought on make beehives, and it almost worked out. We almost pulled it off, and we produced millions of dollars of beehives as fast as we could, but we just could not make them quick enough. So unfortunately, in the last couple of months, I had to let go all 45 employees, and now we're going into a new phase. We were just acquired. All of our assets were acquired, and now I'm going to go work for someone else. So it's a strange set of circumstances, but there's a lot of people getting into beekeeping. There's tremendous support for this type of product, and I'm going to be in beekeeping for a long time. But I just wanted to kind of go back and show you, what one little bug that lands in your kitchen can do to your life. And of course, Henrik is always there observing. Yes?
Who did you get acquired by?
I was acquired by a guy and a couple other investors. So basically, we'll go work for them and rebuild, fix all the problems, everything that came up because of the catastrophe of last year, and reach out to our tens of thousands of customers and explain what happened and move on. But it's been pretty much the worst year of my life, but I am here. And so that was our most popular product, which is right over there. It's a Langstroth hive. We'll talk a great deal about those. That is our retail space with for lease signs in it. If any of you are looking for an amazing retail space, it is for lease over on Hawthorne. We built it out. It looks perfect. So if you need about a 3,000 square foot retail space, it's yours. And I think that's all I got for that part. So I just had to lay that out there for our adoring fans. Do any of you keep bees currently? Okay, there's a good number of you. Any of you interested in keeping bees? I assume some of you who already keep bees. That's cool. So we're going to talk about honeybees. Without them, none of us would be here. Most of our food wouldn't be here. And I'm excited to talk about them. I haven't gotten to teach a beekeeping class in over a year. I've been staring at spreadsheets and talking to lawyers, so this is pretty exciting. Honeybees are the most advanced of the bee species. They live in colonies of upwards of 30 to 50,000 bees. They tend to live inside cavities. And so Winnie the Pooh was lying. Those creatures that were hanging off of the trees in all the Winnie the Pooh books and videos, those are probably some sort of hornet. And that was not honey that he was getting out of there. But honeybees, they like to live in trees. That's the most common place for them. But they also love to live in walls, mailboxes. And we've found them in innumerable spots. And if it's dry and if it's safe, usually high up in the air, 20, 30 feet up in the air. But we like to put them in boxes like these. And they're a superorganism, so they're basically one creature made up of many smaller creatures. And they're always doing what's in the best interest of the colony. They're, I guess if they could think that way, honeybees are selfless. They're always willing to risk their lives for their sisters so that their sisters can live through that next winter. From the time they hatch as a young bee, you'll see them when they come out of their comb. They almost like wet, and the fur on their back is kind of matted down. Their exoskeletons have not fully hardened, and they immediately go start cleaning out the cells nearby so that a new egg can be laid in the cell. They're very clean creatures. And so we'll start with the workers. They really kind of rule the hive. The queen is misnamed. She's more like a slave to her daughters. It's the daughters who protect the colony. It's the daughters who make the wax. And to me, the wax is one of the most important aspects of a honeybee colony. It's like the bones of the superorganism. Without their wax, they have no place to lay their eggs, to store their food. It's absolutely critical to their life. And from the time they move into a cavity, whether it's a beehive like this or a tree, they're going to begin building wax as quickly as possible. And you'll see it. Overnight, you might have a comb, like this, or multiple combs that are this size. And the next day, they'll continue to grow until they fill up the entire structure with their wax. And they will repurpose that throughout the life of the colony. They may start out storing eggs and nectar and turning that nectar into honey, and then later on may use it all for nectar, and then may revert back later on in the season and fill it with more eggs, larvae, and pupa. So the workers, it's not my presentation, so I got to learn what she did here. The workers hatch usually in around 21 days. The queens take around 16 days or so, and drones take the longest. Drones are the males, which we'll also talk about. And so upon hatching, they'll go through a number of roles. There we go. So they usually start out cleaning the cells nearby, and you'll see this again as soon as they hatch. And later on, they may become a nurse bee. The nurse bees are the ones who are feeding the young eggs and larvae and pupa as they're going through the development process. And then later on, they may be fanning. Fanning is an important part of a honeybee colony. They'll use it to evaporate the nectar, evaporate the water from the nectar to turn it into honey. Because honey is nectar that has had the moisture removed from it until it's about 80% sugar content, at which point the honeybees will then cap off that cell. They'll seal it. It's kind of like they're canning to save it for later, and it will last forever that way. And then they also will fan the hive to cool it down. It could be 110 degrees out, but the bees will actually go gather water from nearby water sources. So if you have a pool, your neighbor has a pool, for instance. This happens a lot down in California. Your bees will almost certainly find their pool and begin gathering water from there. And they can go through gallons of water in a day. And they'll gather that water, and they'll release droplets of it, and then fan their wings over it to bring down the temperature inside that colony. So they're incredibly skilled at managing the inside of their hive. And so a lot of beekeepers worry a great deal about moisture and heat and all these things. But I've had the roofs of my hives blow off in the winter and at out yards, bee yards where I don't go to very often. And it's rained on them for 2 weeks now, and they still survive. And so they're pretty good at dealing with adverse conditions. And then later they will make wax. And I talked about wax, but that's where it comes from. It comes out basically these little chunks on the underside of their abdomen. And then they will take that and then form it into, it starts out as basically a circle, and then it'll turn into the hexagon shape that we all know and love. And the hexagon is really the best shape for this purpose. It takes the least amount of wax and can store the largest amount of material inside of it. So it's the most efficient shape for them to use inside that hive. And I'll pass one of these around so you can look at it. You'll see that it's very light. The red stuff on it is probably from propolis that has gotten on the feet of your bees. And propolis is tree resin that your bees will gather. And so this is a Warre bar from a Warre hive. All this red stuff is, again, it's tree resin that they've gathered, and they will go back to their hive. They'll put it on their legs, just like pollen. They'll go back to their hive, and they'll seal up the cracks so that there's no drafts coming into their hive. And I've even seen them, if they kill a mouse, for instance, and bees don't like mice living in their hives, so they can kill them, but they can't lift a mouse corpse. And so they'll actually completely mummify the thing in propolis so that it can't decompose and cause problems inside their hive. Again, they're very clean, and it sterilizes their hive. So it's this magical substance. Propolis is used a great deal in throat sprays and other naturopathic remedies. And in fact, most things that come out of a beehive can be used in all sorts of ways, from beeswax, of course, honey, we all know, to royal jelly, which is the food that is fed to developing eggs, and then propolis and pollen. Later on, your bees will be guarding their hive. And I should preface this to say that usually worker bees during this time of year might live a month to a month and a half at most. And it's because they're working so hard for their sisters. Because it's really they're storing up food so that their sisters a month from now can try and get through winter. And their wings will start to fall apart, their hair starts falling out, which happens to humans too. And there's a stark contrast between the older bees and the younger bees. And it's pretty amazing to watch. And usually the workers are going to die outside of the hive. There's all sorts of things that can happen to them when they leave the comfort of their colony. And it's really not until the last week or two of their life where they actually leave the hive to go forage. So next time you see a bee, a honeybee, foraging on your flowers, you'll know that she's probably coming to the end of her life. And then swarming. Swarming is the method by which honeybee colonies reproduce and make more colonies. And I'm going to show videos about that. But this is the time of year where it's still happening. Usually the peak of swarm season is April and May. We'll still see swarms in June. But basically the honeybee colony will split themselves somewhat in half. So you might see 10, 20,000 bees leave the parent colony with the old queen. And they'll actually slim her down. They'll starve her so she can fly. Because otherwise she's too fat to fly. So the workers,
Just this is about swarming, maybe you'll get to it later, but is there kind of a threshold in the season where you're like, okay, I'm good to have this swarm? You know, like is there a part in the summer where if you've reached a certain time, they're probably not going to swarm? Giving them enough room to expand?
Yeah, usually by mid to late June, it's more unlikely that they're going to swarm. But I've seen swarms in August. And the later they swarm, the less likely it is they're going to be successful because they still have to basically set up a whole new house and they got to go find a new nesting site, and they'll often move into old nesting sites. And so many times when I would go to homeowners' places where they'd have a swarm hanging on their tree, they'd point at the tree from which it came and say they've been there for 20 years or something. And I know it's probably been 20 colonies that have lived inside that tree. It's just that the new swarm has found it. It smells good. It smells like beeswax. Obviously, it was a good spot for these other colonies. And so you'll have many, many generations of honeybee colonies moving through these trees. In Ladd's Edition alone, which is, again, where our retail store was, I think there were over 20 feral colonies that documented living in the trees there. Someone had gone through and counted and made a little map. And there's probably a lot more. There's got to be millions and millions of honeybee colonies throughout the country, but there's only around 2.6 million managed colonies in the U.S. Let's see. So drones I'll talk about next. Drones are the male bees inside your colony. The cells that they develop in look like this. They kind of stick out a little bit more. You can see these cells down here are worker cells. They don't stick out as much from the face of the comb. And up here are a few more drone cells. Next to that is some pollen, and then up here a ways is nectar that's not been ripened yet. So you'll start to learn these things as you go through your first honeybee colonies. You'll start to figure out what is in the wax. And I can take that. Thank you. And it's pretty important to figure out just by looking, even just by lifting a comb, you can usually tell what's in it. If it's really light, either it's empty or it's brewed. Developing bees don't weigh very much, but honey weighs a lot, and it weighs a lot more than water. So as soon as you lift one, from a top bar hive, for instance, which is one of the long bee hives we'll talk about, those combs might weigh 7 pounds when they're completely full, whereas they might weigh a pound or less when they're empty. So the drones take the longest to hatch. They kind of have a bad rap in the beekeeping community. They don't forage. They don't have stingers. They don't protect the colony. Their sole purpose, as far as we know, it really is to mate. And they're basically like flying sperm capsules. And they kind of roam about like a group of teenagers. And you'll hear them leaving the hive. It sounds like a bunch of little lawnmowers taking off. And they're not very adept at flying. I mean, they crash a lot, and they crash into you. And the cool thing with drones is they can't sting. So like if you have your first friend come over to look inside your hive or come near the hive, you can grab a few drones and hand them to them, and they'll be terrified, and then later tell them they couldn't have stung you anyway. So the drones, again, their sole purpose is to find a queen to mate with. And the cool thing about this is they don't tend to mate with their own queen, their sister, because the queen can fly farther than the drones. And so when the queen leaves the hive to go mate, and this would be once she takes over her mother's hive, because remember, when the swarm happens, the old queen takes off and goes with her daughters to this new place. And then a new virgin queen takes over her mother's hive. And so she's not ready to lay eggs yet. She has no sperm to fertilize them with. And so she'll leave the hive and go on her nuptial flight, and she'll go to what's called a drone congregation area, which is usually a decent ways away from that colony, usually kind of in a stand of trees or near a meadow, and she'll just fly around, and drones will be watching. They have these giant eyes, you can see, that are significantly larger than the eyes of their sisters, if I can get back there. Here's a better shot of it. So that's a drone. You can see their eyes wrap all the way around their heads. And really, they're just flying around looking for this queen. And whoever gets there first gets to mate. And they have video of this you can watch on the internet, of a comet of drones is what it's called, chasing after this queen. And he gets there and does his deed, and then his sex organ is ripped off, and there's supposedly this popping sound as this happens, and then the drone plummets to the earth and dies, and he is successful. And this will happen 10 to 20 times with that queen. And she'll keep going on these flights until she's full. She stores it all up in her spermatheca, this big sac inside of her, and then she'll go back to her hive and she'll lay eggs the rest of her life. And she can lay upwards of 2 million eggs in her life. And she can live upwards of 5 years, usually less than that, but she can live significantly longer, kind of like termites. Like termite queens can live like 30 years or something, or 50 years. So it's just shocking to me that these bugs can live that long. So the queen will go back, she'll lay her eggs. And unfortunately for the drones, if they fail to mate, so they're running out of time now. June, it's getting late. Next month, it's going to get even harder to find a queen to mate with. By September, October, they're pretty much doomed because the workers, their sisters, will actually drag them out of the hive like this. You can see here, this is a bunch of male bees cowering in the corner. And this is a worker bee dragging a drone off the entrance and throwing him into the grass. And the worker bees, the sisters of these drones, know that they're not going to likely live until the next spring, and so they don't really need to exist anymore. They're just going to eat resources in that colony, and so their sisters kill them. And usually yellow jackets or other creatures will move in and rip them apart and go feed their young. So it all works out, but it always works out badly for the males. Many beekeepers like to mark their queen with a colorful mark on the thorax. And this helps you see the queen inside your hive. It also tells you what year she was installed. So there's a color code based on the last digit of the year, and I never remember the color code. But usually beekeepers will buy the queen this way, and then a few months later they'll go out and they're no longer marked. And that's probably because your colony swarmed and you didn't even know it. Or your colony didn't like their queen and they killed her and replaced her. So they're very good at that. And this, again, is a queen. And she always has this group of workers following her around and making sure she's well fed and groomed and taken care of so that she can lay eggs. And so really she is a servant to these daughters who are following her around. And as soon as she weakens and she maybe is not laying eggs as prolifically, the workers will start to come up with other plans. And so they'll actually take eggs and they'll continue feeding royal jelly to those eggs throughout the duration of development. And we've learned in the last year that it's not the actual feeding of the royal jelly, but it's the keeping back the bee bread, which is the other food that's fed to young bees as they're developing. By starving them of bee bread, they grow sex organs and turn into queens. And so up until now, we thought it was feeding royal jelly was what did it. And really, it was just withholding this other thing. So she'll be fed royal jelly, and she will turn into a queen, and she'll grow in this cell, and I don't know if we have one in these slides. But usually from the side of the comb, it would maybe be down over here, or sometimes it'll be out of the center of the comb. You'll see this thing that looks like a peanut hanging off of it, because the queens are significantly larger than the workers or the drones, and so they need extra space in there to develop. And so the workers will monitor that, and they may raise 10, 20 queens at once. And so you'll go into your hive and you'll see these queen cells all over the place, and you'll know your colony's planning usually to swarm. And they've already decided a month ago, maybe, to do this. And new beekeepers will freak out. Some of them will go cut all the queen cells off, and now you may have just killed your colony because that was the only way you were going to get a new queen. So don't do that, please. Just wait for them to swarm, and they will. And you can try and stop them, but just like most creatures, they want to reproduce and make more colonies. So there's reasons why they might swarm that could be your fault, But often you give them plenty of space, you do all the right things, and maybe they're just doing well and they want to make more colonies. A guy named Dr. Thomas Seeley wrote a book called Honeybee Democracy, which is an amazing book if you're into these sorts of things. He's studied bees for many, many years, and he talks about the reproductive method of honeybee colonies of swarming and how they choose new nesting sites and all this sort of stuff. And to him, it's a good thing colonies swarm differently than they would be in nature. Honeybee colonies are not the family dog. You buy a dog, it lives for 10 years, everyone's happy, it dies, and you're sad. Honeybee colonies reproduce a lot, and they may swarm 2, 3, 4 times in one season, and they may die that winter. But now they've made 4 more colonies. And it's hard for people to wrap their mind around because they get into this hobby with the expectation their bees are going to be with them for many years, and they might die for every year for the next few years, and it's pretty demoralizing. So many people will start with 2 or 3, a better chance. Hive over here. The brood caps are fuzzier. And a close-up of eggs is here. We have larvae. So you can off top right, you can still could go bad on. So just I wouldn't worry too much, but just try and find combs that are completely sealed like this. So we've been interacting with bees for thousands of years. We've been stealing honey from them probably the longest. Some person figured out that, wow, I can reach into this tree full of honey and I get stung a lot, but it's worth it. It was the first. They didn't have sugar, so honey was used through the Middle Ages, which is why we had mead, and why mead sort of died off as cane sugar became available. So this guy is in Nepal. His friends threw him off a cliff. And he's actually interacting with the giant honeybees that live there. And they live usually on the side of a cliff like this. I used to work for an Indian company doing IT work. And many of my friends that lived in India would actually see these types of colonies where they grew up, the villages they grew up in, as well as in the cities, hanging off of hotels and other things. So they live exposed, whereas our European honeybees that we keep live inside of cavities 99% of the time. Every once in a while, you'll find one that swarms, maybe half a mile or a mile up, which are these woven and on the sides of it. And this is a skepist, as it's called. I think this is in Germany in the 70s. I think they had something like 1,000 skeps in their apiary. And it's just really fun to watch the different way they interact with their bees. These beekeepers love swarms. They like lots of little colonies, whereas American beekeepers like a few gigantic colonies. We like our hives to be 8 boxes tall with 200 pounds of honey on top. These could maybe fit 20 pounds of honey, 30 pounds of honey. So this is probably more like the type of cavity bees would choose to live in if we let them have their own way all the time. But we like to take a lot with little input. So honeybees are used extensively in the United States for pollination. Without them, something like 1/3 of the food we eat wouldn't exist. And this is what's called a holding yard in the almonds down in California. So if any of you have been in California in February near the almonds, you've probably seen many semi-loads of bees moving through the area. And every year, one of them jackknifes and dumps millions of bees all over the highway, and everyone freaks out. But bees, again, are brilliant. When that happens, beekeepers usually come out and they'll work together to find a way to get the bees. Probably be a lot of fight and go this and I think nowadays they're paying upwards of like $150 a hive to pollinate. And some of these bees going into the almonds. So they can make a lot of money in a few weeks. And many of them don't love that they have to do this. It's just, this is how they make money. And this is beekeeping industry is like today. Most of them, they love bees. They got into it just the same reason why I got into bees. Or colonies go into every state in one spot to spread their diseases to each other and then go back to where they came from. And it's probably not the reason why we're having so many problems with bees, but it's one reason why it's probably not helping. So there's many different hive designs, like I talked about. There's probably been thousands of hive designs over the years. The Langstroth hive, which is what the flow hive was made in, is really the most hive in. It's deeps. These are 9 5/8 inches tall. Them there are came up with was early on when he and beekeepers had already. But already figured it out. If you're off, and they start hitting you in the face, it's kind of to warn you, like, go away, stop doing whatever you're doing. And that's why the beekeeper will smoke them. And so smoke has been used for probably thousands of years. And it doesn't take a lot of smoke to I guess, minimize that alarm pheromone of your honeybee colony. And so when bees are upset, they'll release this smell. It smells like like bananas, and it's pretty strong. And when you smell that coming out of your hive or on you, that's usually a bad sign. You've done something to make them really angry, and now it's time maybe to close it up gently and figure out what you did wrong. Sometimes your colony, maybe they're in a bad mood. Maybe the nectar flow is over, they're having a bad day. They're a creature, and you never know what they're thinking. So if you smell that, either go away or get out your smoker and give them a couple puffs of smoke. If you know your colony is really strong and healthy, you want to light your smoker. I don't have one with me, but there's a million videos on the internet of how to light a smoker. Just throw in dry organic material, leaves, burlap, something like that, and light it on fire, puff it, and then close the thing, and then wait until there's cool white smoke coming out. Like if flames are still coming out, do not put that on your bees. They do not appreciate that. And it just takes a couple puffs just right inside the entrance, and then wait a minute, and then go inside your hive. And usually that'll change everything. Your colony will, at least for a good while, leave you alone for the most part. You can do whatever manipulation it is and then get out. My philosophy is pretty hands-off. My thought is they've been doing this for millions of years, and I have been doing it for 10. So they know a lot more about being a bee than I do. But there are things that we can help with. And if we go in and we see there's no eggs, well, either your colony's preparing to swarm, because they starved their queen so she could fly, or your colony's queenless and they're going to die soon. And so that's where you might want to just observe that hive, monitor it. It is very helpful, again, to have two, because then you can compare and contrast the two. If one of them has lots of traffic and everything looks great and the other one has almost nothing, well, maybe go look inside the empty one. Well, what is going on in there? And you might be able to fix it. If you only have one, you have no idea what to compare it to. And we've had many new beekeepers with one hive not understand that their colony is really, really aggressive. I had one in particular. I went to their house to go inspect with them, and they told me I needed to put on my bee suit before I even stepped out the door because their colony was so mean. And most European honeybee colonies are pretty docile. Like, they're not going to try and kill you. This one, I stepped outside the back door. I'm like 30 feet from this hive. I was getting hit in the face by bees. And so I'm glad they warned me, because I would have been stung a lot. But I told them, this is pretty not normal. This is weird. And they just given up their backyard to their bees. They're like, we love them, so we let them have everything. And I'm like, all right, I mean, that's totally up to you, but it seems like a liability to me, because they're pretty mean. And so you can either give those to your friends you don't like, or you can requeen them, so you can go buy a queen. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It's hard to get them to take your queen sometimes. You spend $30 on this queen, you have this insect in a little box, and you usually have to go kill the other queen, so you gotta go find her, and beekeepers call it pinching the queen, and some of them do that, just brutally pinch her. I always feel bad when I kill a queen. She's so important to this colony, and I'm going to kill her, and what are these bees thinking? But I've done it before, and then you put the queen cage in there, usually with a marshmallow or something, so they can slowly release her, and then hopefully they like her and everything takes off. Oftentimes, it's just easier to take your other colony, give them some eggs, and kill the queen, put some eggs inside, and see what comes out. And many times that will minimize it. Or you can split your colony. You can take one strong colony and take half the bees and put them in one box, the other half put them in the other box, make sure both sides have some eggs, and usually both of them will come out alive. And sometimes this will calm your colony down. So there's all sorts of little tricks you can learn as you start to keep bees. But yeah, a Langstroth hive, most common hive out there. There's a few different box depths. I only have deep boxes with me, I believe. Again, these are deeps. And then inside, this is a flow box, which we can talk about at the end. But this is a medium frame. So again, I'll show you the different sizes of frames. This is a deep, this is a medium. And some people will use all medium boxes because they're a little bit lighter, which is what I usually do. Many folks use deeps. This is still the standard in the US. And they're heavy. These boxes, if this was full of honey, could weigh 80 pounds, which is no fun to lift when you have stinging insects chasing you. But you can do it. A medium box is 40 to 60 pounds, depending on how full it is. And then foundation is the other thing. I don't have any foundation here, but foundation is used by many, the vast majority of beekeepers out there. And foundation is either pressed wax, and so they'll take actual beeswax from beehives and then melt it down and then press it into the hexagonal shape. and usually they'll put some wires through it and then put it inside that four-sided frame, and then the bees will build off of that. They'll do what's called draw out that comb, or they'll use plastic. Like 90% of the foundation sold today is plastic, and so they'll use plastic, and sometimes they'll spray it with wax so that it's more wax-like. And that, the great part about plastic foundation is it's indestructible. I mean, you can really manhandle the stuff. The drawback with it is it's plastic, and if bees could talk, I'd wonder if they really like plastic foundation, but they use it, and we know it works, and it's very functional. Most commercial beekeepers use it. I mean, they're trucking their bees all over the place. They don't have time for their foundation to break in half or melt or deal with all the problems with that. Me, I don't use any foundation at all, so I would give them these boxes with a stick or a wedge. I showed you this is a bar for a Warre hive, so this goes inside that little Warre box over there, and it has a little wedge cut into it. So this creates a point from which the bees can build their combs. And so they usually will attach their combs to a point like that. I say usually because, again, they don't care about you. And so they may start at one corner of your box and build completely diagonal through that box and be completely content with their decision. And then you are very unhappy with your bees because now they messed up your hive. But you got to remember it's their hive, and they're going to do what they want. So you can even see that there was wax on here that we cut off at one point. And you can do the same thing in a Langstroth hive. You could take a wedge or you could take a popsicle stick and you could put it on this frame so the bees can build their combs from it. And again, so many people don't realize Langstroth didn't have foundation when he invented this. It did not really exist. It wasn't mass produced yet. So he did exactly what I'm talking about. So foundation, there are some benefits to it. It allows you to extract. So you can put your combs inside a centrifugal extracting machine, which is especially helpful if you're a large-scale producer of honey. If you're using foundationless frames, you need to cut the honey out of there and crush it and strain it. It is not as efficient. It is a lot cheaper because you don't need a fancy machine. You don't need to buy foundation. So for backyard beekeepers, many of them are moving foundationless. But if you're in this for honey and you need to make a lot of honey, it is nice to be able to take hundreds of frames at a time, put them in an extractor, spin the honey out, and put the frames back. So again, you got to find the right balance for you. It lets you reuse that comb again and again, and generally they'll cut the caps off with a hot knife, and then they will put it in there, spin it out, and the bees will reuse that wax. And there's beekeepers that have 50-year-old wax inside their hives, and it works. The problems with it, you don't know really where it came from. It came from someone's beehive, and you don't know what chemicals the bees were foraging on, or what chemicals the beekeeper was applying to the hive. There's a lot of medications used inside beehives to fight mites and disease and other things. And I like to just let them start as fresh as possible without any of that stuff. It is pretty expensive. It's more expensive than the wood that it goes around it. And it is one cell size. And so you'll see a lot of diversity in the cells in your colony. They may range from 4.6 to over 6 millimeters in diameter. Whereas our foundation we buy is all one size. And again, we don't know what impact that has exactly on the bees, but we know they don't produce as many drones. And we know a healthy feral colony produces a lot of drones. And so when a beekeeper starts transitioning from foundation to going foundationless, many times they're shocked because suddenly their bees are making all these male bees, and they freak out. They're like, why are they doing it wrong? They're making all these boys. And we don't want those. But again, the bees want those because that's going to help spread their genetic seed out into the world. And so again, we got to listen to our bees a little more. So problems as well, you do need fancier stuff to harvest the honey. It's a little harder to cut, crush, and strain if you're using plastic. You can try and cut all the stuff off, but it's pretty messy. The bees, if you give them the option, and I've tried it a lot, I've put in some frames without foundation and some with it. Most of the time I've seen them go to my empty frame and build off of that and ignore my plastic foundation at first. Eventually they'll build it out. And a lot of other beekeepers have seen that too. We talked about foundationless. A horizontal top bar hive is basically meant to mimic a tree on its side. So imagine bees are living inside a tree vertically, standing out in the forest. Now imagine the tree has fallen over and there's still a cavity to live in. I've seen it many times, bees living with their combs mostly oriented lengthwise. And it works. They're one of the most common designs out there. Eva Crane, in her book, The World History of Beekeeping and Honey Hunting, believes it is the most common design in the world. Some sort of trough with sticks laid across it. And there's ancient Greek hives that use this method. But the cool thing about it is you're not lifting boxes. With this type of hive, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 boxes stacked upon one another, and they're very heavy. And when you go inspect, if I take this inner cover off, I've just exposed the entire top of my hive, and there's thousands of bees staring at me, wondering why I'm in their hive. With a horizontal hive like that, all the bars are pushed against each other, and the bees are building one comb next to the next comb until they fill up that entire cavity. And so you're really only exposing one comb at a time. So I find it gets stung a lot less with that design. The disadvantage of it is it's a fixed size. It does not get bigger than that. And a strong colony can fill up that hive. It's about 40, that one's about 44 inches long, which is about 2.5 of these. And so there's pictures on the internet of people with like 15 of these boxes stacked upon one another in Alberta or the large honey producing regions of the world. They can make a lot of honey. I've seen new beekeepers. I've been to Canada speaking about beekeeping, and I met some new beekeepers. They just started. They lived in Alberta, and that first season they harvested 200 pounds off their hive. In Oregon and Portland, we're happy if the second season you get 30 or 50 pounds. So it's all beekeeping is local, wherever you're at, or if you're watching abroad, find local beekeepers to talk to. Even in our region, find folks that are as close to you as possible, because then you can learn what they're doing, what's working and what's not working. So the cool thing with them, again, is you're not lifting heavy boxes. The heaviest thing you have to lift is one comb at a time. You don't need an extractor. You can just cut the combs right off of it. And again, I don't get stung as much with that design. You can also put windows. You can put windows in every hive. We do. There's a window on this one, which is actually really helpful. I can go out and I can quickly see how much of my bees built up, or do I even have bees anymore. So in the winter, I can look in the window and knock, and usually you need to knock, and then they'll all come running toward the window and try and sting you because they have no idea what's happening. You got to remember, bees live in total darkness for 3/4 of their life. They're living inside a tree. They're using their other senses to communicate, feel and smell. And so it's really not until they leave the hive where they have all this light that they're experiencing. Warre hive is a vertical top bar hive. So this is a Warre box, and you can see it's smaller than those other boxes. It's also square, rather than being rectangular. So a Warre box is it's about the width of an 8-frame Langstroth box. This is an 8-frame. This is a 10-frame, which you can come up and look at the end. But again, it's square. And so it was invented in France in the early 1900s by a monk. He had something like 300 hives at his apiary. He had many different designs, and he came up with what he called the people's hive. He thought it was the best hive for everybody. It used simple materials. It could be spun. You could go one way or the other. The boxes were square, so you didn't have to deal with your base like this. And it didn't use frames or foundation. In his final edition of his book, I think the 12th edition, he finally came to the conclusion frames and foundation are not worth it for the average beekeeper, and top bars are the best method. And the main thing with it is the philosophy of being incredibly hands-off. Now, he did not have varroa mites. He didn't have many of the diseases and things we fight as beekeepers in the States today. So it was a lot simpler time in the early 1900s to keep bees. You put them in a box, you'd harvest honey in the fall, and it was great. But so he would go in, if you read his book, he went in twice a year. He went in the spring to give them boxes, and he went in the fall to harvest. The rest of the year he did not touch them. But then you read other parts of his book, it sounds like he did all sorts of weird things. So I have no idea what Abbe Warre really did, and I'd love to hang out with him, but he's dead. So usually you'd start a Warre hive with 2 boxes, like the picture over here. And then on top of those boxes is what's called a quilt box, which is a box that usually has sawdust or cedar shavings of some sort in it. And then on top of that is a roof that has kind of a dead space in it, like an attic. And there's a lot of Langstroth beekeepers, this type of hive, that are starting to incorporate that into their design to try and manage or keep a more constant humidity and temperature inside the hive. And I have friends who put temperature sensors in their hives and found it does help. It keeps a more consistent temperature. You don't have so many fluctuations like you do on like a day like today, and tonight it's going to drop, which could be helpful for the bees. And if we look at what they usually live in, your tree cavity could be 3 inches thick on all sides, and there's a tree on top of it. So there's not as much heat escaping from the top of a tree cavity. And then with the Warre, you add boxes to the bottom. Most Langstroth beekeepers will start with 2 of these boxes and then add boxes above. And that's definitely easier for the beekeeper, and it also can help you produce more honey. But Warre looked at bees in the wild and saw they move into the tree, the top of the cavity, and they build their combs downward until they run out of room. And again, that could be 6 feet tall. I've seen bees in walls where you have a 6-foot tall comb inside. And then they run out of space and they start swarming. And he wondered, why are we adding boxes above? This never happens in the wild. And so he wanted to mimic that. It's called nadiring, adding below. And so he'd start with 2, and then as the colony grows, he might add 2, 3, 4 more boxes to the bottom of that hive. The cool thing with that is it creates a cycle. By adding below and taking from the top, every couple of years you're getting all your old combs out of the hive. And so you're creating a nice clean cavity. There's no really old wax inside of the hive. If you only add to the top and take from the top, like you usually do with the Langstroth, your bottom few boxes remain in place for many, many years. Yeah. How do you physically do it? You become very strong, or you have friends. Warre had monks or under monks. I don't know. He had minions that did his. Yeah, so I would take, in this case, I'd take the lid off, take the quilt off. Right below the quilt is another piece of canvas, generally. And that piece of canvas I leave in place, because then all the bees are not exposed and coming out and stinging me. And then I can usually lift 2 full boxes on my own, and then I'll have a friend add 2 more boxes. Or if I don't have any friends, I'll take those boxes and put them kind of diagonal on top of another empty box, so I have the least amount of surface area to smash bees. Because every time you set down a box, there's thousands of bees on the underside. And the new beekeeper sometimes will just drop it right in the grass, and you just killed hundreds of bees. And as soon as you start killing bees, they release that pheromone that tells them, hey, we're dying, this is terrible. And then all your bees are mad at you. So be sure you don't set them down like that. So add the boxes, put the full boxes back on top. And you're doing this like once a year. So it's not like every week you got to go out there. If you did, you're going to have a very, very large colony. Or they're like the Warre beekeepers are the nerdiest of the beekeepers in my experience. They create all sorts of cool contraptions to go with their hives. And on a Warre box, there are handles sticking out from the side. So you can use like a little forklift. And I have friends, and there's many on the internet who've done it. They've created a little hive lift. They'll wheel up to the hive, lift the whole thing up. The bees have no idea this is really happening because it's very gentle. And then they'll put the boxes under and then crank it back down. And I encourage you to do that if you have time. Natural combs, I just like showing this. You can see the bees here are doing what's called festooning off the bottom of that comb. I just like saying that word, but that's basically where the bees are like, they think like measuring out where they're going to build next. And usually you'll see that. They'll in this case, the chain of bees would have been about this shape, and then the next day you might see a piece of wax there where they were hanging the day before. Research, all of you are here hopefully learning something. You need to figure out, are you going to keep bees? Did I just scare you away from it? If not, you need to figure out, are you going to build a hive, buy a hive, what design are you going to go with, and find a spot for it. There's a lot of people that want bees in their yard. They don't necessarily want to keep bees, but they want bees. And so we have them call all the time saying, please put lots of beehives on my property. You could go on Facebook and post and say, hey friends, I'm going to start keeping bees. I need your yard. And I bet you'll find someone. Then equipment. You know, you'll need a veil or a jacket. This is a beekeeping jacket. I've worn it a lot. This is a ventilated jacket, which is awesome. If you're going to get into this and really get a lot of hives, I encourage you to get a ventilated jacket because they stay cool. And usually you're out in your beehive, it's 80 degrees out. You have this heavy jacket on, you're wearing gloves, you're lugging boxes around. It's very sweaty and tiring. And so it's nice having a breeze blow through. Gloves, beekeeping gloves, pretty much every beekeeper starts with them. Many will move away from them over time as they become more comfortable with their bees. And you know, it does hurt your dexterity a little bit having these thick leather gloves on. And if you can feel, if you have the risk of getting stung in the hand, you're going to be a lot more careful with your hand placement. And the less bees you kill, again, the happier everyone is going to be. So again, many beekeepers will move away from it. Some beekeepers say they don't feel stings anymore. I always feel stings, and I always swear, and I always swell up horribly, especially on my hands. Like I look like Quasimodo. So I don't know if it's just me, but you know, unless you stop breathing, you're probably fine. Like if you swell up, that's pretty standard among people who get stung. A hive tool I already showed you. Bee brush is really just it's a brush, and it helps to get bees off of things as long as you know how to use it. You don't want to gently brush them across the combs. This angers them. They get very upset at you when you're like rolling them across their combs. But if you launch them off the comb in one motion, it's like they didn't even know it happened. And so many people don't like their brush because they're doing it wrong. Find a mentor. There's a million beekeepers in Portland. Many of them want to talk to you about bees and beekeeping. They may not even like your hive design, but they will probably want to talk to you about bees. So they've kept bees longer than you, and I'm sure they can help you out. Portland Urban Beekeepers is a group I belong to. They're awesome. It's probably one of the more open-minded beekeeping communities. There's a lot of beekeepers are very set in their ways. There's one way to do it. It's the only way to do it. And if you don't do it that way, you're doing it wrong. I've tried lots of different ways, and it all tends to work. I think a lot of people want to feel like they're helping their bees, and they really want to go in and do stuff to them and feel like they did their part. The bees never look happy, in my experience. They usually seem to want me to go away. So I try and leave them alone. But in the end of the day, every beekeeping club, everyone there loves bees and wants to help bees. So check with your city, your county, to see is it legal to keep bees. The city of Portland, it is definitely legal. You do need to register, but you don't have to ask permission of your neighbors anymore. This just got changed in the last few years. It's very helpful. You can tell them I'm going to keep bees, but they can't really stop you anymore as long as you meet certain requirements. And then if you have over 5 hives in Oregon, you do need to register with the state of Oregon. I think it's like $10 or $20. It just tells them, hey, I have a lot of bees, and here they are. And then, you still may want to talk to your neighbors. Even if you don't have to, just let them know, hey, I'm going to keep bees. And that way, if anyone is actually allergic to honeybee stings, that's the thing. Many, many people think they're allergic to honeybee stings because they swell up. And again, I always swell up. But if they have trouble breathing when they get stung, that's a very different thing. And if they're carrying an EpiPen, then yeah, you may not want to keep bees. Or at least you may want to put it in the other side of your yard and make sure that they're very careful. Yeah?
You might have trouble for a landlord. Technically, is a bee a pet?
Is a bee a pet? That is a good question. That is a good question.
Registration, you have to have permission from your landlord if you're renting.
So if you have less than 5 hives, you're working?
For Multnomah County, you have to have for any hives, any honeybees, you have to have written permission from your landlord if you're a renter.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of different legislation on this. Clackamas County, you don't have to do anything. At least I'm in unincorporated Clackamas County, so I can put beehives all over the place, and no one can really do anything. But again, other cities are far stricter about this. And up until the last few years, it was easier to keep bees on your roof in New York than it was in Portland. So I'm glad that everything changed. Placement, easy access is one of the most important things. I used to keep bees, again, in wine country. It was cool, but it was always frustrating having to drive an hour and a half out there and back. If you're going to put them on your roof, that's cool, but just think about, a year from now, if you're going to harvest honey and you got to carry, a 60-pound box down a ladder, just plan that out. Make sure you figure out how are you going to get it down, and yeah, you're going to want to go out there more than you realize, just to be around them and watch them. Early morning sun is very helpful. It's going to get them active earlier in the day. They're going to forage more over the season. In other parts of the country, they aim toward certainly afternoon shade, sometimes full shade. Like if you're in Arizona, it gets really hot, and they're going to need some sort of shade and water. And if you can put out some water for your bees, like a bird bath with some rocks in it, something where the bees have access to land, where they don't drown as easily. If they can go get their head under the water, they will drown. They're very, very good at killing themselves. My first colonies that I got 20 packages of bees my second season, and I made all these little jars with floats in them out of plastic. I thought it was a brilliant idea, and so the jar had syrup in it and then a float, but the bees rushed the floats, sunk the floats, and I filled up 20 jars with dead bees my first night. So I was totally demoralized. I thought I was the worst person on earth. And thankfully, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that many bees, but it was thousands of bees I killed. So I was off to a bad start. So yeah, if they can drown themselves, they will. Give them access to water where they can get out of it, like corks or anything they can to float. Yeah?
So there's 3 hives on the farm that I'm on. I'm taking care of them, and we just
I mean, once they find a water source, it can be hard to get them off of that water source. They tend to want to go back to it because now they communicate. They do their dance. They tell their sisters, here's the great whatever, pollen source, nectar source, water source, and now they remember. Next day they're going to go back to it, and then they're going to communicate again. There's still a lot of water there. More of us should go, and then soon you might have 100, 200, 300, 400 bees lined up around your pool, drowning. Yeah, I think you can try giving them other water sources. And sometimes, like if it has something that tastes different in it, people have found they tend to be able to communicate that better, or whatever reason, they go back to it more. So that's why chlorine, for instance, in pools, is a great way to get them to come back. Yeah, the other option is drain the thing, give them another water source, and then refill it. But it's probably a lot of water.
On top of that, I put a dish on top of each hive with rocks in it, because at one point when I first put the dish on it, I was finding randomly a dead bee.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I put the rocks in, they don't seem to die anymore. But I just make concerned about it.
Yeah, and it is hard for bees to communicate a source of food right on top of them. And so other colonies might come get that water, but oftentimes your bees will not realize it's basically on top of their head. So you might want to put it like 10 feet away or something. So water source, forage. It's not such a big deal in the city. There's a lot of flowers in the city. It really is. Beekeeping is viewed as this pastoral thing that happens out in rural areas. But I know from selling beehives, most beekeepers are in cities. That's where the people are. And there's many, many people getting into it. And there's a lot of forage available in our cities. There's basswood trees line our streets. There's a lot of organic gardens and backyards and our rooftops. So there's a lot of food available in the city. But when you go out to like wine country, bees don't forage on grapes. They will forage on the grape juice. They'll suck it out of the grapes that fall. But they don't forage on grape flowers. But blackberries they love. But in a land of monoculture, where there's one flower predominantly, it can be hard for our bees. And so that's why it's great that many wineries are starting to plant cover crops and other things for their bees, or for all the pollinators, because it helps the entire ecosystem. But it's a lot easier in the city to not worry so much about forage. And level ground. Level ground is very helpful. The bees tend to build their combs perpendicular to the ground. And if your hive is on a slant, this one for instance is like this, all your combs are going to be like that. And then they may not be straight inside the frames, and they can become really hard to get out. This was my bee yard. This was my backyard up until someone built a house right here. It looks like a rural area. I'm the old house, and then there's a bunch of little McMansions surrounding me, and then they put one right there, blocking all my sunlight, and all my swarms would land on their house. And so I moved most of my bees to a different yard. So getting bees, swarms are my favorite way. And again, I'm going to show you video in a second. And packages are another method. So again, package bees, you're going to need to order packages very early generally, usually by winter, very early the next year, January, February. Otherwise, you run out of time. There's a huge amount of demand for packages. And they come in this little box. There's about 3 pounds of bees in there, around 10 to 12,000 bees in the box. And there's a queen hanging inside there in a cage. And she's probably from a different hive. These bees have been shaken through a funnel into this box from many different colonies, and then they put usually a can full of syrup on top, and that way the bees have something to eat on their trip, because they may start in California and end up in Montana or New York or who knows where, and it can be a long trip. So they're pretty resilient. I don't know if they like this, but it works, and it's one way to get bees moved all over the place easily. And then the other option is what's called a nuke. I don't think I have a picture of those. A nuke is like a miniature hive, so it might be 4 or 5 frames worth of bees, it's a great method to get bees because they come, they already have eggs, they already have larvae, they already have some nectar, some pollen. They're basically a little colony ready to be transferred into your full-size hive. And so that's probably a better way to get bees than a package. But swarms, I've had the most success with swarms, because the swarm, it chose to swarm and make another colony. They're local. They could have come from your neighbor's hive that just came from California. So it is a crapshoot. You never know what you're going to get. But oftentimes, especially if the homeowner can tell you, I watched them come out of my tree and land here on this branch, those are my favorite ones to get. because they could have been living in that tree for a couple of years without medications, without feeding, without being manipulated by humans, and those are the ones I found live the longest with least interaction from me. So today through early next year, figure all this stuff out. There is a cool swarm list. It's called Bee Allies. And so back when I started, it was a constant battle between beekeepers to get to the swarm first. Homeowners would call anyone they could find, and they'd call 10 of us at once, not let us know that 10 of us just got called. We'd all drop everything, leave work, pack up our bee gear, run to North Portland or wherever, and there's already 5 people there. And we're like, who gets it? Like, we all just skipped out on work, and now only one person's going to get the swarm. So it was really annoying. And so someone came up with this new list where it automatically will call randomly one of the next people that hasn't had a swarm call recently. So it kind of spreads the love a little bit and works well. And it'll let you choose a region you're willing to service. So if you don't want to drive to Vancouver, you just say, hey, I want to service my zip code. And then only swarm calls in that zip code will call you, which is pretty cool. You can also get bees from your friends. If you find someone who already has hives, they almost certainly have swarms. Many of them don't want more bees. It becomes this addiction. You start with one, and I have many people that say, I'm just going to have one, and the next year they have 3. And then I have some lady who started a few years ago, and now she's got like 20. So you could go that far, but many people don't have enough space or money or time to manage that many colonies. So they get swarms, and they say, who wants it? Someone come get this thing. And it works out pretty well. And then April is really, March, April are really where everything starts in our region. And Alaska, I'm from Alaska, their season might not start till June. So again, it is all local. But March, April is when your bees start getting more active. They start certainly laying a lot more eggs. Swarms start happening. So that's the exciting time in beekeeping. And then toward late summer, early fall, it's getting more boring. And winter, you're just hanging out waiting for spring again and waiting to do things in your beehives. Let me see if I can make this work. Oh my gosh. So I talked about packages a little bit. Oh my gosh, what is he saying? So that is a queen cage, like I was talking about. This is a plastic queen cage. And so again, there's a queen in there. There's something called fondant on this end. And inside there are a couple attendants with that queen, kind of keeping her company. And so I'll often take a nail and kind of jam it into the end of that candy, the fondant. But you just got to make sure when you do that you don't impale your queen. And I've had people do this. They're so excited, they're shaking, and they just jam that nail right through and stab the queen. So just gently stab it. It gives the bees a little bit of a head start to start eating through the fondant. And so this is going into a top bar hive, which again, I don't have one up here, but the queen came inside that package. I'm laying her, in this case, I'm laying her on the bottom of the top bar hive. If it was really cold out, I would not lay her there, but the weather was decent. Because what can happen is, if it was 30 degrees out, I laid her there, I dumped the bees on top of her in a second, the bees would go cluster above, and she would just freeze on the bottom of the hive. But I know it's nice weather. It's nice laying her there because then they don't build comb around the queen cage. Because if you hang the queen cage from a top bar, they almost certainly will build comb around it, and then you have this weird object stuck inside your first combs. And many times it will make the first combs crooked. And so I think here, I'm about to dump them in. Really, you can just shake them in, and you don't have to be that gentle about it. I try and get as many of them out as I can, and then I will lean the mostly empty package up against the entrance so that the stragglers can waddle their way up. Yep. If they do build comb around her? She's stuck in there right now. They're going to release her over the next couple days. It's quite unlikely that they would completely entomb her. That could happen. But generally they're going to just start getting some wax built.
She's still okay.
Yeah. And so in a couple days I would come back and I would just reach under and grab that queen cage and make sure she's been released. If she's not been released at that point, usually I'll just open it and let her walk right into the cluster of bees. There will be a cluster hanging there right above her. And so on a top bar hive, again, it's long. I'm going to put the top bars right back on top and seal up the entire top of that hive. And the stragglers there are going to be communicated to by the bees above that are near that hole. they're going to be fanning their wings and releasing a pheromone from their Nasonoff gland, telling the other bees, here we are, this is where we're at. And you can smell it. I mean, it smells like lemongrass oil, which we'll often use to lure bees into things. And so lemongrass oil, you could put inside this beehive, put it out in your yard, and then come home one day and have bees, which is my favorite way to get bees. You know, it is a swarm, but it's now a swarm that's moved into your hive on its own. And that's really the coolest way to do it, I think. No. I don't know what's going on here. There we go. Sorry.
So do you have quite a bit of YouTube?
Yeah, we have a lot of YouTube videos. This is what a typical swarm looks like on a branch. And you know, this is really an ideal swarm. It's at a good height. I can get under it. I can basically shake them right off their branch into the box. But swarms aren't always this easy. You know, if they're on a structure, you can't shake a structure, like just shake like a car or a side of a building. So it's usually you got to brush them in or try and get a few of them. Sometimes you can just pick them up and grab a few and throw them in the box, and then they'll get the hint that, hey, we're moving. And so in this case, I shook most of them. And as soon as, if the queen fell in my box, the rest of the bees will usually follow. They'll start moving into the box. If she is still up on the branch, they'll leave the box and go back up to the branch. And it can be annoying. You know, you'll know in a couple minutes. If they all start evacuating, like you turn a vacuum on reverse and start shooting it out, that's what it looks like when you did not get the queen. And the worst is when you shook the queen and now she's on the ground. And then you got to try and get them to go in the box, and you don't know where she is. It's hard to spot a queen in a clump of 20,000 bees.
Say you're doing an inspection and you shake and your queen comes off. Are they all going to leave the hive and try and protect her?
You mean so you're in your hive and you drop her on the ground?
Hive, you're inspecting one of your frames and you shake off into your frame and you accidentally jettison your queen. Will they all leave the hive, or are they just?
No, I mean some will definitely find her. It's like I've killed queens. You know, when I've replaced them, I've taken them out and like stomped them on the ground because I don't have the heart to like crush her with my bare hands.
Right.
But usually I'll see a few attendants go down there and like mourn the loss of their queen. But I'm sure that your colony will now start taking some eggs and making new queens. That's what I'm thinking would happen.
Right.
So yeah, in this case, I just shook them in. I'm going to wait a few minutes. It's ideal if you can wait until night, because then all the bees should move into that box. But many times you've driven 30 minutes out of town. You do not want to wait there for the next 4 hours. And so I would just try and get as many as you can. Any of the stragglers that don't make it in that box are pretty much doomed. So, and there's still scouts flying around the neighborhood that are looking for their new nesting site. They're going to come back and find their sisters are all gone, that they missed the bus. And they're just going to hang on that branch for days and days, wondering what happened. And so you can go back the next day and shake a few more in. And I've done that. You know, if it's close enough and I can run by after work and try and get more bees. Or I'll have the homeowner just leave a cardboard box there so they can just kind of go into that, and then I'll grab that. So on the ground, again, this does happen. And in this case, they were on the ground. They'd fallen off of a branch. Maybe the wind blew them or something. By the time I got there, they were all on the ground. And so I just took a handful and I threw them into the box. And then you can see they all start running toward that clump. The queen may not have even been in that clump, but usually I found that if I give them a nice spot to hang out that's not in the open, they start running toward it. And so after a few minutes, you'll see they all tend to go in. And so this is what I was talking about with lemongrass oil. So this is, basically it's a flower pot I hung from the side of a shed. And I put lemongrass oil in the flower pot, and then I waited. And I was out there working in other beehives, and I heard a swarm coming into my flower pot. And so it's one of the coolest ways to do it, because they chose to be there. They want to live in that cavity. The flower pots are not ideal, because if you're gone for a few days, they could fill up that thing with comb. And now you have to destroy all their comb, or try and get it out carefully, and then you can try and use rubber bands or other methods of putting it into your frames. but it's a mess. So ideally, you can use your actual hive or a small version of your hive, and if you hang it up, it improves your chances. So that book, Honeybee Democracy, by Dr. Seeley, he talks about all the criteria that impact the honeybee colony's decision to move into a cavity, from the height to the way it's facing to the entrance size. He's done all the studies on that. Yeah.
You find that you have to have that trap swarm at a certain distance from where the swarm comes from so it works?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've never had one of my own colonies move to a bait hive within like 20 feet of where their hive is, which makes sense, at least from Seeley's work, that they don't like to live that close to each other. But I've had other colonies move, like that one came from across the way. I had 15 colonies lined up here. This one came from some other hive I didn't know. So I encourage people, if you have neighbors or a big yard, put it on the other side of your yard, or put it in your neighbor's yard 2 blocks away to improve your chances. And again, it's kind of a gamble. You're just putting boxes up and hoping bees move in. So I think if you're really planning to start beekeeping, you might want to plan to buy a package or a nuke, as well as maybe put up some bait hives and things. Because there's no lack of demand for packages and nukes. If a swarm moves into your hive, you can just sell that nuke to someone else. You could sell it in 10 minutes if you go on the internet. And then you've covered all your bases. Because what's worst is people buy a bunch of equipment and then they can't get bees, and then they're stuck for another year. And it's really demoralizing. Questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, I want you to answer other questions too, but how many hives do you have personally now? What's your personal involvement in beekeeping? And then also, where's your business going? What's your website? How do you know it is?
Yeah, so I mean, in our bee yard where I haven't gotten to keep bees in a while, I think we've got like 15 hives right now. Top Bar, Warre, and Langstroth. We have lots of bait hives hanging up. So a lot of my employees or ex-employees at this point are it's kind of like the communal bee yard where they've all been managing, and so it's fun to go out there and see what they're doing with all the hives that, some of those swarms I caught years ago and now are still there swarming, and it's fun to know like that was back when I used to keep bees a lot, and now this new phase I'll probably get to keep bees more, which is cool. So where is our business going? Everything was acquired. Right now we're dealing with trying to make hundreds of customers happy who got in the lurch with all this, with everything collapsing in the spring. It's like the worst time for a bee supply company to basically go under. And now we got to make hundreds of people happy because we let them down. People ordered stuff and we couldn't deliver, and we were stuck. There was no lack of demand. Like if we'd had thousands more hives, we could have sold all of them. And that's the frustrating thing. It's like so many people want our stuff, and we surely just could not keep up. And that killed us. So that's demoralizing. Where's our business at? Bee Thinking is our business. And right now our retail is closed, and we're basically in the process of starting up again and in some form manufacturing and fulfilling the same type of hives.
Still be bee thinking?
99% sure, yeah. So many questions.
I just had a question more about behavior than anything. I had an entrance feeder that I recently took out because the nectar flow is pretty heavy. And I'm seeing clearly more, I guess, motion and whatnot on the other side of where that feeder was. I'm also seeing a little bit of what looks like festooning underneath. I have a laying. So underneath the frames in the entrance. So it seems like they're all just kind of balling up at the bottom between the bottom board and the bottom of the frames. Is that something I should be concerned about? Or
How many boxes are on it?
So they were almost, I think I had 8 of the 10 frames drawn out. After putting in a nuke, I checked every week. And once they got pretty close, I put another deep on top. And I moved 2 of the honey frames up top to kind of help them move up. And I had foundationless, but I asked someone who's a beekeeper and
Yeah, I mean, they'll often build some burr comb. Burr comb is like the comb we don't like in weird spots, if they can fit it.
That's what it seems like they're doing. And when I opened it a few times, it was brood. They had some brood in there in that bird comb.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the end of the world. Like, they should start moving up into that top box, and you could try and inspire them to do so by moving a couple more frames up, if that's your goal. And if you're going to use some foundation and some without foundation, it's good to alternate them.
Sure.
Because if you have a foundationless comb or foundationless frame and then foundation, and you stagger every other one, they cannot build a crooked comb now inside this hive.
Right.
Because they have to obey a bee space, as they call it. Just for those who don't know, like, they always leave around 3/8 of an inch between their combs. And so that's one way. You don't even have to use guides in that case. You could just have a already drawn frame in between every one. Many people do that.
Would it be, I know it would be really inconsiderate for them, towards them, if I, took those frames up and scraped off that comb that they're building underneath, basically the space that I don't want them to be building, but as long as they're not queen cups, they should be fine.
Yeah, and they're going to do it again. So, like, you can keep scraping their things away, and they'll probably just go do it again and wonder why the giant keeps cutting their stuff off. Yeah, I mean, yeah, probably. You can try and talk to them. Yeah.
So you didn't talk too much about the flow hive, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are around it, because I know that you talked about the success of it and how many people wanted it and how hard it was to fulfill it because it was so successful. And on the other hand, not wanting to have the foundation and the frames because the bees don't like the plastic, but yet this is all plastic, and so how does that work? How do you see that? Like, how do the bees react to it? I haven't seen one personally.
Yeah, so, I mean, the flow hive, the innovative thing about flow hive is it lets you harvest honey without opening the box. And so Cedar and Stu, the guys who invented it, they really, at first I was very wary of their thing because, one, it was annoying me because it was all over the internet and everyone was sending me links to it all day long. As a beekeeper, it was the biggest thing that happened to beekeeping in the last 100 years. But at the end of the day, it's just another way to harvest honey. And so the flow frame looks like this. It is all plastic, and the guys who invented it don't even like plastic. These are pretty green guys. Like, they are like people that sit in trees and try and protect the forest. Like, this is not their thing, but they could not think of another material to use when they came up with their invention. And it took them like 10 years to invent this thing. So the way it works is the bees go into these cells, they put their nectar in there, they cap it off just like they do any other cell. And then once it's sealed, you can take a special tool, reach in the top here and turn it, and it'll make one of these pieces shift up or down. And when it does that, the honey goes into a channel in the middle and then leaks down through this into the bottom. And I might not be able to get it off, but and comes out a tube on this end. And so the cool thing is you don't have to go and rip your hive apart or uncap things or smoke your bees to harvest. You can harvest and then close it back up. And the bees, I've done it. I've been to Australia with them and watched it work. Like, it really does work, and it's pretty cool. But really, as long as people understand it is another way to harvest, it's okay. I mean, the problem, and they know this, is that a lot of people took it as the way to never go in your hive at all, or even manage your bees in any way whatsoever. And so I think there was a lot of people that got into this a little irresponsibly. And they've done a lot to try and mitigate that, because really they do want people to be successful in beekeeping. They really do care about bees. That's why they made this thing. Unfortunately, it did turn into something completely different than what I think they expected. In terms of the plastic, yeah, sometimes the bees are hesitant to draw plastic, whether it's flow frames or regular plastic frames. So many beekeepers will paint some wax onto them or spray it on if they have a method of doing that. Other times they just go up and use the frames. I know that's how they've done most of them down there. But it definitely works. And I think one of the main reasons it was so successful is they were very smart. They reached out to like a dozen expert beekeepers, including Michael Bush, someone I know and respect, and said, use this thing and tell me if it works. And he said, I can't believe it, it actually works. Like, many of them were very skeptical, and they tried it and they were shocked. And so that was pretty brilliant of them to wait a whole another year to get that feedback from trusted experts before they released their campaign. And I don't think it would have been as successful if they had not done that. But yeah, as long as you know it's another way to harvest, and know you still have to do other things, and you still need to know about bees. Yeah, it is plastic. It's probably nicer plastic than plastic that's used for most of the other foundation that's out there. I mean, they went to great lengths to use the best possible material they could, given their limitations having to use plastic. It's another way to harvest without an extractor. Now, I don't think it's that hard to harvest by crushing and straining or doing cut comb. It's also very expensive. It's one of the most expensive beehives out there. But it did get a lot of people thinking about bees and beekeeping. So I think there's a lot of conflicted views on flow. And again, at first I was very wary. Part of the reason my business is where it's at now is because of flow. But I've also learned a lot, and I think that was invaluable. Other questions? Yeah. Flow Hive, I think they're like $700. And the majority of that is the frames. And I'll pass it around. There's a lot of engineering that went to this thing, and it's they're handmade in Australia, so they're expensive. Yeah.
Will you still have a physical presence in Portland?
So will we still have a physical presence in Portland? Not in the near future. I think eventually I think we'll probably end up in some other retail shop, or maybe partnering with some other entity. But most of our sales are online, and at the end of the day, retail, I love having retail. I like being the urban bee supplier, and that's authentic to me, rather than being out in some rural area. Like, I want to be where most beekeepers are, and that is in the city. So it's unfortunate, especially having built out our amazing retail space, to have to close our retail space, but that's just where we're at right now. So it's frustrating, but I think it's going to lead to being able to do more good in the long run. So we'll work on that for sure. Other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Oh, also, sorry. Portland Urban Beekeeping has a meeting tomorrow at 7
Oh,
at Rose City United Methodist.
Portland Urban Beekeepers has a meeting tomorrow night at 7 at Rose City United Methodist. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody so much for coming out. We return on June 20th with Conscientious, founder of Kill Rockstars Records, and you can hear her on the podcast and on X-Ray FM, The Future of What, and she's talking about the current state of the independent music industry. It's going to be a really awesome talk, and we're super stoked to have her. And let's have another round